No, no, not death. Life. Eternal life.
Her eyes were mesmerizing, her voice was enthralling, and her lifetime eternal. Countess Marya Zaleska has been one of the most astounding fictional villain female characters in the genre of vampire movies. She is the daughter of the notorious Transylvanian nobleman Count Dracula. But there are ambiguities around the fact that she was a biological child or whether she was an adoptive one. She is believed to be a century old, but other detailed insights into her origins or backgrounds continue to remain obscure. Marya's story in the movie gains importance after Count Dracula has been destroyed by the occult practitioner Professor Val Helsing after getting his heart plundered with a stake in the cellar of Carfax Abbey. The Whitby police, led by Sergeant Wilkes and Constable Albert, arrest Helsing on the charge of murder. Professor Helsing is then escorted to Scotland Yard, where he attempts to convince Sir Basil that he can't be charged with murder given that Count Dracula has been dead for 500 years and he wasn't human but a vampire. These fictitious claims don't appeal to Basil, and he informs Helsing that there are only two courses of action that can be followed now, with the first one being him charged with homicide for the gruesome murder he committed and be sent to the gallows, or if he reiterates his unscientific alibi about having killed a vampire, he could be assigned to the institution of the criminally insane. Helsing tries to explain to Basil that he has indeed done human beings a great favour by protecting them from the gore of a vampire, and being charged with murder is the last thing he should face for his act of goodwill. Meanwhile, Count Dracula's corpse has been stationed in the Whitby jail under the oversight of Constable Albert. Even though well aware that the dead won't rise from the grave and start walking, the constable keeps a pistol to himself to ensure his own safety. Albert is surprised by the sudden visit of a rather atypical woman in the jail at odd hours in the calm of a winter night. She had embraced the lofty silk long black drape to herself all from head to toe, with only her enigmatic eyes visible. She inquires about the body of Count Dracula and demands to see it for herself to ensure that he is dead. Albert forbids citing the commands of the sergeant from Scotland Yard. The woman tries to corrupt the constable's integrity by offering him money, but it's all in vain. She then uses her final tactic. Under the influence of the mysterious jeweled ring, she takes control of Constable's consciousness and evades Count Dracula's body, leaving no trace of her presence in the jail. When the officials from Scotland Yard arrive, they are welcomed with an empty casket case and the motionless constable. The wolves' moans pierce the serenity of the calm winter's night, indicating the presence of otherworldly entities. The scene follows with Countess Marya Zaleska igniting a pyre in the woods wrapped under fog. On the pyre lay the dead vampire, her father Count Dracula. With a complex set of expressions of grief and rejoice, she sprinkles the holy salt and commands the spirit that threatens the soul of men to be banished, and for the body of the long undead Dracula to be forever consumed by the purging flames of the pyre. Toward the conclusion of the funeral, Marya walks towards Sanders, celebrating the beatitude of her freedom. Her eyes were hopeful for the future that would now not be engulfed into the dark shadows of the dead, but the bright world of the living. She is now liberated from the bane of immortality, desolation, and death. Marya could cherish living her life blissfully as a woman freed and seek solace and happiness that she has been devoid of for decades. Sensing the arrival of dawn, Sanders and Marya depart for London. As another night arrives, Sanders warns Marya that maybe this night too would have the same fate as all the other nights. Marya outrightly rejects this claim and reaffirms that with Dracula's body in ashes, the wretched spell that dawned upon her had been broken. She can now do normal things, think normal things, and also play normal music. With hope and enthusiasm, Marya plays the keys upon a piano and asks Sanders to be her audience. Peacefully, she plays the lullaby that her mother used to sing to her ages ago on the night of the twilight. Her eyes sparkle as her fingers gracefully move over the keys, producing the cradling song. As the pleasant music continues, Marya begins to imagine the peaceful shadows lurking by the mountains with the wings of beautiful birds and the barking of dogs. Sanders, however, brings her back to reality, claiming that the shadows are not of the peaceful but of the evil. The wings fluttering are the black bats and the barks are rather the sad howling of the wolves. Marya's face is overcome with distress. She commands Sanders to be silent. She refuses to accept Sanders' argument that the music is an indication of dread and not elation. She counters it by reaffirming that she is finally now unencumbered by her unpleasant past identity. She has been released from the shackles of darkness and hopelessness. However, she is soon distraught when she realizes the veracity of Sanders' words. Sander further assesses that her eyes do not speak of sparkle but of death. Disappointed, Marya dons the cape and her rings and begins to tread on the murky lane of London, looking for her next predator to quench her thirst. She soon returns and retires to her casket before the descendant of dawn. The scene is followed by Janet, Dr. Geoffrey Garth's secretary, informing that his presence is desired by Professor Helsing, who is currently under arrest in Scotland Yard. Garth visits the professor but is perplexed given that he isn't a lawyer who could help acquit Helsing of the charges of homicide. Helsing expresses that he instead wants Garth, a reputed psychiatrist, to prove to the jury that his rationality is intact and that he is not insane. Garth, however, believes that Helsing claiming Count Dracula is a vampire is fueled by misplaced superstition and not scientific factors. Helsing reasons Garth. He says that as a psychiatrist he should be more cognizant about the thin line between the superstition of yesterday and the scientific discovery of tomorrow. Garth counters the professor by quoting that the interplay of science and fiction could only be understood by the academia, but these arguments won't stand against the legal contours. Helsing, a bit disappointed, declares that if Garth declines to defend his conviction, he shall very well do it himself. Given the disciple-master legacy that Garth and Helsing had, the former assures that he would do anything in his power to prove the latter's innocence. Dr. Garth then attends a society party where the Countess is also a guest. Garth is left mesmerized at first sight by Marya's gorgeous persona. The host introduces the two, and then while they all sit down for tea, she inquires about the Val Helsing case that has been capturing the news headlines for quite some time. She asks Geoffrey if he knows the professor, to which he narrates that he had once been Helsing's student. The host further reiterates that the people are eager to understand the scientific explanation of the existence of vampires and thus asks Geoffrey to further the story. Another guest interjects, questioning whether Geoffrey believes in the preposterous claims of the old fellow, to which Geoffrey replies that he doesn't, but he believes in the professor. Geoffrey quotes how the professor had been deeply engaged in research around the existence of vampires, so much that he had become obsessed with them. He, however, concludes that this obsession is a mental disease which, just like any physical ailment, could be cured. The human mind could be released of mental obsession by the symptomatic treatment of being suffered. It is the word release that catches Countess's attention. She expresses her intrigue to the doctor to talk alone about the same sometime soon. Following this scene is Dr. Garth visiting Marya's residence for the supposed counselling session. His wit is quick to notice that there are no mirrors in the house, despite it being occupied by a beautiful woman. Marya very playfully jokes that had Professor Van Helsing noticed this, he might have assumed her to be a vampire, as according to an old Hungarian legend, vampires are the resurrected dead and thus wouldn't be able to cast reflections in the mirror. Marya then continues to explain to the doctor her troubled mental consciousness. She questions if the unearthly beings, the dead, can influence the living. Garth rejects the idea, but Marya interludes that there does exist indescribable superhuman powers that rise from beyond the grave and fill her mind with sinister instincts. Garth says that the strength to overcome this unwanted compulsion lies within her own self. He advises that the next time she encounters these unwanted thoughts, she must not escape but face them. Face them, meet them, fight them, and triumph over them. Marya is now hopeful and decides to test her capability by fighting the dark and dead with her inner will. She asks Sanders to fetch a model as she desires to paint tonight. Sanders comes across the desolate young woman, Lily, by the bridge and dupes her into coming to the studio as a model to pose for Marya's painting. Lily arrives and is warmly welcomed by Marya. She's offered wine, food, and the warmth of the fireplace in this chilled English winter. Such hospitality rids Lily of any suspicion of smelling foul of the intentions of the Countess. The Countess asks Lily to remove her blouse and pose by the fireplace as she aims at studying the shoulders and the head of this young woman with her art. As Lily slides down her blouse and exposes her white shoulders, Countess Zaleska's ascriptive iniquity overpowers her and defeats her resolve to restrain her thirst for human blood. Helpless at her inherited vampirism, the Countess advances towards Lily, flashing to her the exotic hypnotic jeweled ring and preys upon her like any other brutal vampire would. Unresponsive Lily is then brought to the inspection of Dr. Garth in the context of her suffering from an extreme and unusual case of amnesia. Upon observation, Dr. Garth denies it to be a case of amnesia and suggested that he would carry forward a post-hypnosis to deduce further about Lily's indescribable condition. Later, a doctor brings to Garth's attention the two bite marks on Lily's neck that eerily resemble an animal bite mark. Even though inconclusive, Dr. Garth begins to suspect that this could be the work of a vampire and thus decides to visit Professor Van Helsing to discuss the case further. The professor advises Dr. Garth to get to know about the place where Lily was attacked and its vicinity where he could find this resultant vampire. He says that all he should look for is a soiled old box to which the vampire must return at night before being exposed to sunlight in the morning, and a place with no mirrors, as vampires do not cast a reflection. It's the mention of the mirrors that puzzles puzzle Dr. Garth as he recalls his meeting with Countess Zaleska in her apartment, which too didn't have any mirrors in sight. Meanwhile, Countess Zaleska is overwhelmed and disgusted at her act of haunting Lily and thus visits Dr. Garth. She explains how she put herself to the test last night and her determination failed as she was overcome by her ghastly desires. She says that she's thinking of leaving London that very night as there is nothing but utter destruction and horrors of the dark that lay ahead of her. Dr. Garth catches the drift of the wind and, to confirm his suspicion, asks Marya to take the mechanic post-hypnotic test that involves the usage of artificial light and a lot of mirrors. Horrified at this mention of mirrors, the Countess interrupts and instead asks the doctor to come along with her to the continent where she would make all the necessary confessions. She pleads to the doctor, claiming that he's the only psychiatric credentials that can free her soul and relieve her from the brutal reality that has been haunting her for an eternity now. Dr. Garth refuses and instead accuses the Countess of not being transparent and asks her to wait calmly and convince herself to confess to the complete truth once he returns after inspecting Lily. He also warns her against leaving London. Countess Zaleska, however, is hell-bent on leaving that city and also making sure that the doctor follows. For this, she plots another devious plan of abducting Dr. Garth's secretary Janet with Sanders' help. Dr. Garth begins the post-hypnotic experiment with Lily after she can talk. However, Lily is traumatized as she begins recounting the horrific details of the unfortunate night. Before her last breath, she tells the doctor about the light from the ring the woman had in the studio in Chelsea that had been located near a bookshop. Dr. Garth goes back to his study and finds Marya absent. He then immediately heads to Chelsea where he traces down the studio and inquires about the Countess from the bookshop owner. He also makes a call to Sergeant Basil of Scotland Yard asking him to come down to Chelsea. Meanwhile, Dr. Garth visits the studio and is surprised by the Countess's presence there. He asks her to follow her to Scotland Yard, to which she refuses and reiterates Dr. Garth to follow her to Transylvania instead. Dr. Garth refuses, to which the Countess smirks and confesses to having kidnapped Janet. Dr. Garth doesn't trust Countess Zaleska and instead telephones the society gathering, to which he realizes that the Countess indeed was not joking. Meanwhile, the Countess exits the studio and Geoffrey calls Sergeant Basil and Professor Helsing demanding their presence. Upon arrival, Dr. Garth explains that the Countess is none other than Dracula's daughter and that she had taken Janet into confinement and is planning on absconding. Sergeant Basil is quick to respond to the situation and orders the circulation of Janet's pictures and requests the public report if they've seen her. He then receives a call about an unidentified plane having taken off from the airport heading towards France. He also receives a telegram from Dr. Garth where he announces his departure from the private jet to follow Countess Zaleska. Val Helsing, being aware of the evil intentions of the vampire, asks the sergeant to stop Garth as he would only meet death if he follows the Countess to her castle in Transylvania, but all is too late. The festivities in the town of Transylvania are brought to a halt when they notice the wolves howling and the light seeping out of a window from the castle, indicating that Dracula had come back. Horrified, the people desert the streets and rush into their homes. Inside her castle, Sanders inquires about Marya's intention behind keeping Janet alive, to which she responds that she needs Dr. Garth, but not to enable her release from Dracula's curse, rather to spend an eternal life with her instead. Infuriated, Sanders reminds the Countess of her promise of granting him eternal life. He warns that if Garth was to come there, he would only face death and the Countess would suffer destruction. Indeed, Dr. Garth arrives at the castle and is greeted by Countess Marya. Surpassing the pleasantries, he demands to see Janet and discovers that she has been put under a strong spell by the Countess that couldn't be broken with any scientific knowledge. He demands the Countess free Janet, to which she demands the doctor to remain with her eternally among the undead. Dr. Garth agrees to sacrifice his life to the vampire in return for Janet's release. As the Countess begins to flash the reflection from her ring into Dr. Garth's eyes, Sanders shoots her with a wooden shaft and she falls to the ground, while Janet breaks free from the spell and gains consciousness. The police then arrive in the nick of time and shoot down Sanders before he can take aim at Geoffrey and kill him. Professor Helsing then takes Sergeant Basil to the beautiful woman who was a vampire, but is now dead, yet again. Is the Countess more powerful than Count Dracula? Countess Zaleska is a foreign entity in the world of living mortals. Her vampiric supernatural powers are much like her father's. She has embraced immortality, has invincible strength, agility, the ability to perform hypnosis, and vampire bites that turn mortals into vampires. She would use her attractiveness, elegance, and friendly demeanor to catch her prey and evade any possible suspicion from people. However, like her father, it's not clear if she possesses other powers like shape-shifting, altering the climate, or commanding animal species. Initially, it seems that she's much more sympathetic than her father, but that later changes, and her compassion is replaced by cruelty as she's unable to control the temptation for bloodlust. She even gives up the thought of changing herself to live as a normal woman in desperation to obtain Dr. Garth's undying companionship. Marvellous verdict. Countess Marya Zaleska's personality was as tragic and complex as her life. She wanted to break free of the vampiric nature that had compelled her savagery to quench her constant thirst for blood. When she is successful in her pursuit, even after she has burnt her father Dracula's cadaver along with his pyre, she then turned to the aid of the psychiatrist Dr. Garth to enable a mental release and control her murderous and barbaric instincts. When she had tried herself and tested, she had failed to liberate herself from the curses of Dracula. She instead plans on dragging Dr. Garth to her reality of darkness and eternity. She was surely a victim of her situation. All she wanted was peace and serenity, but those were beyond her reach. The only way she obtained that fine mental release was after her other death, just like her father, Count Dracula. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave us a like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks everyone.